Historian's Log. First entry. Fleet of recalcitrant ire. 2558. Our journey to Sanghelios has begun. The promise of a new dawn, the chance to return to the home that was taken from us so long ago, is at last at hand. I must admit, this is a day I thought I'd never live to see. What will the homeworld offer us? Are we welcome there? What will our distant cousins know of us, the scions of those who resisted the Covenant at its very foundation? These are the questions that burn within my mind. I have always wondered what has transpired in the past 3,000 cycles since the exodus of our forebears. And I am sure the same can be said for our brothers on Sanghelios. Surely, they must wonder how this Sangheli subculture cultivated on a world fashioned by the gods and survived all the trials it inflicted upon us. And so, for one who has spent his entire life devoted to history and research, I shall set our account here. For many centuries, the earliest recorded history of our colony has been lost in the midst of time. But with the aid of the off-world Sangheli and the reawakened Flying Voice, much and more has been revealed about the origins of our colony, back onto the days of its founders. With that, this is the saga of the Ussans. The history of our people stretches back more than 3,000 cycles ago, to the twilight of Sangheli sovereignty, to a time where our people were proud and strong. Having spread out among the stars long ago, our ancestors spent generations carefully observing and protecting the sacred relics of the Forerunners. Holding that physical manipulation of such blessed artifacts was blasphemy of the highest order, punishable by death. But then, the Sanshum came, and they brought naught but lies and foul blasphemies. On the harsh colony of Olgathon, their emissaries sought to beguile us with their falsehoods and empty promises. And when they revealed their desire to excavate our relics, to defile them, we could not brook such a sacrilegious affront. The mighty Arbiter, Vima Togad, returned their heads back to their dreadnought, as a warning to all other infidels. How can my words speak of the wrath the Sanshum inflicted upon us once they saw such a display? Their vengeance was truly terrible to behold. A vengeance known to our kind as the desecration of Olgathon. The planet was scorched, its entire population burnt to cinders. What happened next was war. The War of Beginnings, as it is known to this day, raged on for decades. It spread across many Sangheli worlds, bringing untold devastation as the Sanshum sought to obliterate whatever remained of our kind. But we fought back with steel and fire. Throughout this grueling conflict, one warrior emerged to face this threat. Ussa Xellus. An accomplished commander, Ussa led his fellow Sangheli against the Sanshum invaders throughout the war. One of his most notable campaigns took place on Anvarl, a Forerunner world known to us as the planet of Blue and Red, where Ussa's forces were able to withstand a formidable attack by the Sanshum, safeguarding a sacred Forerunner site from the Serpent Necks. He was even bold enough to lead an assassination attempt on a high-ranking High Lord, before their key ship arrived and scorched the site. Yet, Ussa will live on to continue the fight until his final breath. Even still, the war was long and terrible, and exacted much from our people. World after world lost to the might of the Dreadnought. And with that, desperate measures were taken, such as harnessing the power of the Forerunners for our own usage. It proved most effective, even bringing down the Sanshum key ship over Suban. But instead of putting an end to this scourge once and for all, our leaders negotiate with them. And so, the war was brought to an end with the signing of the Writ of Union. Within this writ, we would abandon our traditions, embrace the Sanshum as the prophets of their great journey, and an alliance between our two species would be forged. The Covenant. Those Sangheli who accepted this peace would say that it was to halt the bloodshed, that they now understood the true path to salvation by joining their strength to the prophets. Yet in truth, they had all dishonored themselves. Their writ was nothing more than an act of surrender, a shame no true Sangheli could bear. It was something Ussa Xellus could not bear. To his eyes, the great journey was naught but a ploy by the Sanshum to lord over our species. It was a murky pond in which no Sangheli would dare bathe, as Ussa proclaimed. His words spread across Sanghelios like a raging fire, and those who valued their honor flocked to his cause. In time, a civil war erupted between the true Sangheli who stood behind Xellus, and the cowards who would shackle themselves to the prophets. Inexorably, the war reached the very doorstep of the rebels. The High Kaidons had suffered Ussa's rebellion long enough, and repaid his insolence with fire and blood. Their attack fighters flew high above the skies of the Zealot state, it is said, and laid the keep low. 5 times the bombers attacked, and on the 5th, the keep was razed to the ground. Hundreds died in those fires, but Ussa Xellus was not amongst the fallen. He and his brave followers were driven from their homes by the Covenant, and fled to the southern polar regions of Nuari. From within the caverns of a dormant volcano, they lingered, waited, eagerly awaiting the day to take the fight to the Covenant once more. And in all that time, they spent the last of the Zealot clan's fortunes to acquire vehicles and arms to their cause. All these things proved useless without warriors to use them, however. And thus it was that Ussa ventured across the stars with his redoubtable mate, Sorn, vowing not to rest until they had assembled an army strong enough to free Sanghelios from the iron grip of the Covenant. But such bold recruitment proved harder to achieve than they had anticipated. The writ of union is written. Ussa and Sorn would hear these words uttered time and time again from the inhabitants of the mining colony of Krek. It cannot be unwritten. Their words of honor, of rebellion, fell on deaf ears. The Sangheli of Krek would not suffer the wrath of the Covenant, and so they chose to walk the path of cowardice. Ussa and Sorn sought after recruits and failed, but what they would gain was far more precious. Through the guidance of the aged founder of the colony, Kreka, they found a long forgotten planet of the ancients, a shield world. Though the old warrior would not live long enough to witness what he had set into motion, he had laid the foundation for a new home for all true Sangheli. And it was here that they encountered an oracle. To this very day, it is known among my people as the Flying Voice, but to Ussa Xellus, it was simply known as Enduring Bias, the steward of this world. This instrument of the gods offered safe harbor to Ussa and his adherents, a refuge for those who would not surrender to the Sand Shum. Yet, the Covenant did not sit idle. The Council of City-States sent assassins time and time again, hoping to end Ussa's rebellion with the edge of their blades. One nearly succeeded. An arms dealer, Verticus, sold his honor to the Covenant and concealed himself within the rebel ranks, awaiting the proper moment to strike. That chance came after Xellus returned from his travels and proclaimed their exodus to a new world, one in which they could rebuild and strike on against the Covenant. The assassin would have slit Ussa's throat had it not been for the timely intervention of his formidable second-in-command, Ernica, the Scar Maker. He was seized and torn into pieces by Ussa's followers in a mad fury. Their leader could do little to stop them, but soon enough, he took them from their squalor and delivered them to a shield world that would soon come to be called the Refuge. Within a short time, the refugees established a colony from within this ancient Forerunner world. Structures were built, settlements were founded, and bloodlines forged anew. In time, our ancestors began to call themselves the Ussans, in reverence to the leader who had guided them to this new world. To govern the burgeoning new colony, a rough triumvirate was forged. Sorn would see to all scientific endeavors, while Ernica the Scar Maker oversaw all security matters. And above them both stood Ussa Xellus, the first Kaidan of the Refuge. From within the shield world, they were to wait, rebuild their armies, and fight on against the Covenant. They had food, water, air, and most of all, hope. But for all the promise this new world held, there were concerns as well. There were those who were wary of the confines of the shield world and its flying voice. ever seeing, ever watching. Some questioned the wisdom of hiding rather than fighting on to the bitter end. And there were those who craved power, who capitalized on fear and suspicion to further their own ends. One such was Silas Krolon, an opportunist who greatly distrusted Ussa. He plotted with other like-minded Sangheli to dethrone the Kaidan and install himself into power, and silence those who saw too much through either coercion or blackmail. And when the flying voice inadvertently revealed the refuge's disassembly process, a process that involved tearing the planet apart, more and more turned to Krolon. But his plans were soon undone, for he had grievously underestimated the will and honor of a pair of Sangheli youths, Tursa Ganok and his future warrior mate, Lenur Mol. They unraveled the conspiracy before the Kaidan himself, and the conspirators were all put to the sword, while Silas Krolon was taken into custody. But through treachery and guile, he escaped the refuge aboard Ussa's own ship, the Clan's Blade. No sooner did the traitor fled the colony than he returned, with a fleet at his back. The vile Nishum ran back into the arms of the Covenant and revealed the location of the Shield World, hoping to curry favor with the Sanshum. Soon enough, their fleet surrounded the entire planet. This armada was led by a Sanshum High Lord, Maken Skreaben, an old enemy of Ussa Xellus. And yet, instead of invading the planet outright, he engaged in secret negotiations with the Kaidan. In exchange for Ussa's surrender, the prophet assured him that all his followers would be pardoned for their transgressions and would be permitted to return to Sanghelios. By all accounts, it was a generous offer, but it was one that Ussa could not entertain. He did not surrender to the Sanshum during the war, nor would he do so now. With all peaceable efforts exhausted, the Covenant's invasion of the refuge began, with Silas Krolon guiding their way. But the invaders were not accustomed to the refuge as the Ussans were, and in so doing, they were quickly overwhelmed. Krolon was amongst the first to die, cut down by the hands of Ernica the Scarmaker himself. But it was not through force of arms that drove the Covenant from the refuge, but rather an act of desperation. Before the Covenant could send more warriors against him, Ussa Xellus activated the Shield World's disassembling process. The planet began to shatter, pieces split asunder, and finally, it imploded. The Covenant fleet and its High Lord believed that all its inhabitants were gone. With no enemy to fight, no relics to seize, the Covenant abandoned the system, believing that Ussa Xellus and his disciples had destroyed the entire planet in a mass suicide. They could not have been more wrong. In truth, the disassembly process merely broke the planet into several pieces. Pieces where the Ussans could safely protect themselves from the implosion, hidden from the Covenant fleet. From that day on, the line of Ussa Xellus would continue to guide their adherents from within the pieces of a shattered world, secluded from the Covenant and its Sanshum masters. And no ship ever return to the Ussan system, as it would be known thereafter. In the centuries that followed the events of what the Covenant would come to call the Rending, we need not treat. As time passed and generation followed generation, our language evolved, but our understanding of the ancient Sangheli tongue faded as well, and in so doing, much of our early histories have been lost. What we do know is that following the disassembly, the fragments of the Shield World were placed within a series of asteroid belts, far hidden from prying eyes. But the refuge became a pale shadow of its former self, and soon enough, its steward would fall silent. Before the age of Ussa Xellus had passed, enduring bias fell into a deep slumber when a comet struck the primary section of the refuge. Since that day, many prayed for the Monitor's reawakening throughout the millennia, but the flying voice would remain silent, sealed within a sphere of glass, known as the homage of enduring bias. Yet, without its caretaker, the colony would suffer a slow decline that grew worse with each new generation. Nutritions began to falter. Certain life support systems died out. With the passage of time, more and more vital components would fail. Yet the Ussan people persisted and endured throughout the centuries, guided by the teachings of their founder. Though the memories of Ussa Xellus and his great deeds were fading into legend. To ascertain that there would be no repetition of Salus Krolon's escape, all slipspace capable ships were purged of their data. And thus, the dream of returning to Sanghelios had turned into myth and legend. Lost forever. Or so we had thought. Despite this, Ussa's descendants continued to rule over the Ussan colony as the Kaidons of the refuge. Throughout the millennia, they held their people together through times both peaceful and tumultuous. What began as a meager colony of 400 Sangheli had grown to more than 3,000 souls. But then, the blood sickness came. This was a plague that no one had ever seen before, and festered among the Ussans generation after generation, like poison. And even more strange was that it could not be passed by infection, nor through genetics, but the marks of the disease were well known. It began simply enough, with malaise and dizziness, which was easy to mistake for milder flus. Soon the bloodsick would become paranoid and frenzied, frequently spouting out speeches full of raving rhetoric about the ills of the world. They would also experience hallucinations, which would often be mistaken for visions. But then, they would possess webs of scarlet pulsing underneath their faces and hands. When they felt immense, grueling pain, the end was nigh. Death would claim the victim slowly and cruelly. All this our physicians knew. What they did not know is where the blood sickness came from, how to stop it, or how to cure it. The only viable solution offered was a quick death, or confinement in the isolation ward. Some ignorant Ussans believe it to be a judgment of the gods, and that the end of the refuge was nigh. These prophecies of doom were fanned further during the reign of Kaidon Ussa Xellus, when a faction of bloodsick rallied behind a raving Sangheli known as Ussa Xellus. This madman declared that the forgotten gods had unleashed their wrath upon the dying world and commanded them to use the colony's ancient starships to return to Sanghelios. For his gods granted him visions that would guide them back to the homeworld. He soon established the Way of Xellus and launched a rebellion from within Section 5. They were soon routed by Ussa himself, however, and Ussa Xellus was executed not long thereafter, ejected from an airlock for all to see. That put an end to the initial bloodsick rebellion, but it would not be the last. When Ussa Xellus passed from this mortal veil, it was to his nephew, Baltol, to assume the Kaidonship. His rule began with a food shortage within Section 2 of the colony, giving way for a savage band of marauders to feed upon other Ussans whom they deemed inferior. These Sangheli, known as the Blue Mandibles, ravaged parts of Section 2, gorging upon their fellow Sangheli. Baltol rallied his troops against these cannibals and slaughtered them all, restoring peace to the colony once more. Yet for all his strength and decisiveness, he could do little to arrest the decline of his colony, nor halt the spread of the blood sickness. It even claimed his intended mate, Limti. She barred herself in her quarters as the blood sickness consumed her, both mind and body. Baltol did everything he could to find a cure for his beloved, all to no avail. Sadly, Limti eventually took her own life rather than succumb to the madness of that horrible disease. Though suicide is considered a dishonorable act among the Ussans, the Kaidon was left bereft nonetheless. Despite this terrible loss, Baltol Xellus stood firm in his duties as Kaidon, and spent the next 13 cycles holding his dying colony together. But 5 cycles ago, another rebellion began to fester. A Sangheli who styled himself Kinsa proclaimed to be Xellus reborn and preached his prophecies of doom once more. But in truth, he was no more than another bloodsick Sangheli named Oscar Milne. Baltol and his adherents attempted to take Kinsa into custody at the gathering place at the Hall of the God Mines, where the statues of Ussa Xellus and the other heroes of old were honored. But he underestimated the power of Kinsa's words, for many came to hear his maddening rhetoric. Soon enough, his followers clashed with the Kaidon's loyalists, leaving dozens dead on both sides. The crisis thus triggered a civil war within the refuge, a war that raged on for months. Baltol's forces controlled the primary section of the colony, as they did with sections 6 through 15, whilst Kinsa's rebels held sections 2, 3, 4, and 5. Within their conquered territory, the rebels forced its inhabitants to renounce their fealty to the Kaidon and worship their dead prophet, Xellus. It was within Section 5 that held resources needed to combat the blood sickness, which continued to spread all throughout the refuge. Desperate to stave off the pathogen, the Kaidon dispatched his young second-in-command, Zetens, to lead a raiding party on Section 5 to gather what supplies were left, and potentially foment a local uprising. However, They fell into a trap by the bloodsick rebels. Many were slain, and Sitens was captured by Kinsa himself. From a helmet recorder, the rebel leader contacted Baltol and demanded his unconditional surrender. Instead, the Kaidan challenged him to a float fight match, a game popular among our warriors, a contest that will determine who rules the refuge, once and for all. At the urging of his followers, Kinsa accepted the challenge. But as the fate of the refuge hanged in the balance, a ship arrived in the Ussan system. To our utter disbelief, aboard it were other Sangheli. They were part of the Covenant until the lies of the Sanshum finally tore it into pieces in what soon came to be called the Great Schism. Even more astonishing, among their crew was a Sanshum. This was a former prophet who chose to stand alongside the Sangheli against his own kind, along with a strange, floating creature known to them as a Huragok. Once first contact was made, this engineer, known as Sluggish Drifter, did what prayers and sermons could not. It stirred the flying voice from its slumber. This miracle came not a moment sooner, for the float fight battle had fared very badly for Baltol. The traders brought more combatants than agreed upon, and they were more skilled than Zealous' own. Just as the game went against him, the Kaidan prepared to meet his end as a true warrior. Until enduring bias intervened and saved his life, eviscerating Kinsa in the process. After that, the Monitor wasted little time in ridding the refuge of Kinsa's bloodsick adherents, peaceably or by force. Once that was done, enduring bias and the Huragok finally put an end to the blood sickness. As it happened, the blood sickness originated from a flaw in the refuge's protein feeders, which began to deteriorate over the millennia and half, where the facilities went without any repairs. But the Huragok and the Flying Voice did what centuries of work and research had not. They created a cure against any further signs of the illness and treated those afflicted. With Kinsa's death and the blood sickness cured, peace was at last restored to the refuge. To symbolize our restored unity, the Flying Voice performed yet another incredible feat. It brought all the fractured sections of the colony and made it one again. Though it would never be restored to its former glory, the Oracle took the pieces of the refuge, reunited what had once been shattered, and fashioned them into a ring world, much like the sacred rings of legend. And so, the broken circle was made whole once more. To this day, we Ussans shall ever be indebted to the Offworlders who delivered us salvation from all the woes that inflicted us for centuries, and even more so when they offered us passage back to Sanghelios. Since the day Ussa Xellus took our ancestors to the refuge, the dream of returning to the cradle world of our people had been just that, a dream, unattainable. But now, at long last, the dream was fulfilled. Some chose to take the offer, while many more decided to stay, seeking to rebuild what had been lost. Among those who remained was the Sanshum, Zoresken. His people and ours have been eternal enemies, stretching back onto the days of the War of Beginnings. And it was his ancestor who led the Covenant invasion of our world. But Zo had shown himself to be honorable, and it was he who persuaded his comrades to come to the Ussan system to begin with, against all their doubts. For that, he has forever earned his place among the Ussans. Thus ends my tale. The refuge continues to thrive to this very day under the wise rule of Baltol Xellus. In the cycle since the rediscovery of our lost colony, our distant brothers continue to honor their pledge to return those willing to Sanghelios, such as the commander of this very flotilla, Fleetmaster Arkad Nar Khalul. Some Ussans have even joined the Swords of Sanghelios, a noble order of warriors seeking to free our world from the blight of the Covenant, once and for all. I, however, simply wish to see the land of my ancestors, to marvel at the great wonders of our homeworld. And I am most eager to meet with my distant bloodkin who rules as a Kaidon in his own keep. And thus I find myself asking the same question from whence I began. What awaits me on the homeworld? Shall I be embraced as brother, or seen as an outsider? But these are distractions that serve no purpose and create their own enemies. Whatever I may face, I will be content to simply bask in the radiant glory of Urs. This is Nakai Vodar and Log.